Sir, you might want to be very careful about the man you're talking to, a quiet voice in the crowd said, but by then the moment had already begun to spiral. The late afternoon light poured through the tall glass walls of Hartsfield, Jackson Atlanta International Airport, turning the polished floors into mirrors of moving feet, rolling suitcases, and hurried travelers chasing departures across the country. Gate C-17 buzzed with the steady rhythm of announcements, the low hum of conversation, and the distant whine of jet engines outside the runway. In the middle of it all stood a tall black man in immaculate navy dress blues, the dark fabric pressed sharp, the silver buttons aligned perfectly down his chest, and a row of service ribbons resting above his heart. His name was Commander Marcus Hayes, though almost no one in the terminal knew that yet. What they did notice were the medals, the calm posture, and the way he carried himself with the quiet stillness of someone who had spent many years in disciplined service. Officer Daniel Carter of the airport police noticed something else entirely. He noticed the uniform first, then the man wearing it, and something in his expression hardened almost immediately. "Hold it right there," Carter said as he stepped forward from the security corridor, raising a hand to stop Marcus before he could continue toward the gate. Travelers slowed. A few people paused beside the charging stations nearby. Marcus turned calmly, the leather carry-on bag still resting beside his leg. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady, respectful, and controlled. Carter's eyes moved across the uniform again, lingering on the ribbons, the trident insignia, and the polished shoes reflecting the overhead lights. "That uniform," Carter said flatly. "Where exactly did you get it?" A murmur passed through the nearby crowd. Marcus didn't react. He had learned long ago that calm was often the strongest response. "It's issued by the United States Navy," he replied evenly. Carter let out a short breath that sounded almost like a scoff. "Right," he said, "and I'm supposed to believe that." A few travelers exchanged looks. Phones began to lift quietly. Marcus stood still, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady. Years of military discipline had trained him to remain composed under pressure far greater than an airport misunderstanding. Yet even he could feel the shift in the air around them. Carter stepped closer, his voice lowering but sharpening at the edges. "We've had people pretending to be military before," he said. "Stolen valor. Happens more than you'd think." Marcus nodded once, slowly. "I understand your concern," he said. "My identification is in my wallet if you'd like to verify it." The terminal announcement chimed above them, calling passengers for a flight bound for Washington, D.C. Marcus glanced briefly toward the gate monitor where his own boarding group would be called soon. Carter noticed the glance. "Not moving anywhere yet," the officer said firmly. By now nearly a dozen travelers had paused nearby, pretending to scroll their phones while quietly watching. A mother pulling a carry-on slowed beside a coffee stand. A businessman leaned against a pillar with his arms crossed. Marcus reached slowly into his pocket, moving carefully so there would be no misunderstanding, and produced a dark navy identification wallet. He opened it and held it forward. Carter looked at it for barely a second. His expression didn't soften. If anything, it tightened. "Interesting," he said, "but IDs can be made anywhere these days." Marcus felt several eyes settle on him from across the terminal. None of them knew the full story yet. None of them knew that Marcus Hayes had spent 20 years serving the United States in some of the most demanding missions the military could assign. None of them knew that he had been on aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, in briefing rooms deep inside military bases, and on operations that would never appear in headlines. And none of them knew that in exactly 12 minutes he was expected in a classified Pentagon briefing that could not begin without him. Marcus slowly closed the ID wallet and slipped it back into his pocket. His gaze moved to the large digital clock hanging above the gate. The second hand ticked forward with quiet precision. Carter followed his glance and folded his arms. "You're not in a hurry anymore," the officer said. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached calmly into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped one contact, lifted it to his ear, and when the call connected, he spoke just one sentence in a voice so measured it barely rose above the sound of the terminal. "Sir," he said quietly, "there appears to be a situation at the airport." The call lasted less than 4 seconds. Marcus Hayes lowered the phone slowly and slipped it back into the inside pocket of his dress uniform, as if nothing unusual had happened. Around him the terminal continued moving, but the rhythm had changed. Conversations had quieted. Several travelers who had been walking toward the gate had slowed just enough to watch without appearing obvious. The polished floor reflected the navy blue of his uniform and the bright airport lights above, and for a moment the entire scene felt strangely suspended in time. Officer Daniel Carter stood a few feet away with his arms folded across his chest, clearly convinced that the situation was already settled in his favor. In his mind this was simple: a suspicious uniform, a man who looked out of place, and an airport full of people who expected law enforcement to act with certainty. Carter had handled situations like this before. Most of them ended with the person quietly leaving or admitting a mistake. He expected this one to end the same way. Marcus Hayes, however, did not move. He stood with the steady posture of someone trained to remain calm in environments far more intense than a busy terminal. The medals on his chest caught the afternoon light each time someone walked past, small flashes of silver and bronze that told stories the crowd could not yet understand. A teenager leaning against a nearby pillar whispered to his friend while holding up a phone, quietly recording. A woman with a rolling suitcase slowed her pace near the coffee kiosk, pretending to read a message while keeping her eyes on the unfolding scene. None of them knew the details behind the uniform. They did not know about the years Marcus had spent deployed overseas, or the quiet ceremonies where those medals had been pinned to his chest. They did not know about the briefing scheduled in Washington, the one that had already gathered officials inside a secure conference room waiting for his arrival. What they saw instead was a calm man and a confident officer standing in a tense silence beneath the glowing departure screens. Carter shifted his weight slightly and glanced toward the identification badge Marcus had shown earlier. "You know," he said after a moment, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "If you were trying to impress people with that uniform, this is not the place to do it." Marcus looked at him, not with anger but with a level patience that seemed almost impossible in the situation. "I am not here to impress anyone," Marcus replied quietly. Carter gave a short laugh that sounded more like disbelief than amusement. The airport loudspeaker chimed again above them. A calm recorded voice announced the beginning of boarding for another flight heading north. The sound echoed softly through the high ceiling of the terminal. Marcus glanced again at the large digital clock hanging above the gate entrance. 11 minutes had passed since he first stopped walking. Carter noticed the glance and shook his head slightly. "Still watching the time," he said. "Got somewhere important to be?" Marcus considered the question for a moment before answering. "Yes," he said simply. Carter spread his hands in a gesture that suggested the answer did not matter. "Well," he replied, "right now you are staying right here until we figure this out." A man in a business suit stepped closer to the scene and lowered his voice toward Carter. "Officer," he said carefully, "that uniform looks legitimate." Carter did not even turn toward him. "Sir, I appreciate the input," he replied firmly, "but this is an official matter." The businessman stepped back again, sensing the tension. Marcus remained silent, his breathing steady, his expression calm. In another part of the country this moment might have passed quietly. But far away, inside a secure office in Washington, a phone had just been set down by someone who recognized Marcus Hayes by name alone. That person did not ask many questions. The message had been clear enough. Within seconds another call had been placed. And in less time than it takes for a passenger jet to begin boarding, several people inside the Pentagon had already started moving. The tension in the terminal did not disappear, but it changed shape. People were no longer pretending not to watch. Conversations had lowered to whispers, and more phones had quietly lifted from pockets as travelers sensed that something unusual was unfolding in front of Gate C-17. Officer Daniel Carter remained firmly planted between Marcus Hayes and the boarding lane, his stance relaxed but unmistakably authoritative, the posture of someone certain that control of the moment belonged to him. Marcus stood only a few feet away, tall and still, the deep navy color of his dress uniform contrasting sharply with the bright airport lighting and the constant movement of travelers behind him. The service ribbons on his chest caught the light each time someone walked past, small flashes of color that hinted at a long story most people in the terminal could not read. Carter studied him again with a skeptical expression, clearly convinced that patience alone would eventually force the man in uniform to admit something was wrong. "Let me ask you something," Carter said after a moment, his voice calm but edged with doubt. "If you really are what you claim to be, Why would you be traveling alone through a civilian terminal like this? Marcus answered without hesitation. Because that is how most service members travel. Carter tilted his head slightly, unconvinced. Around them, the quiet circle of onlookers continued to grow. A college student with a backpack stood beside a charging station, filming discreetly. A family waiting for their connecting flight had stopped rolling their luggage entirely, the parents watching while their young son stared at Marcus's uniform with open curiosity. None of them knew the significance of the small gold insignia pinned above the ribbons, or the silver trident that marked the uniform as belonging to a member of the Navy SEAL community. To most people, it was simply a striking military uniform worn by a man who remained remarkably calm while being questioned in a crowded airport. Carter stepped a little closer, lowering his voice slightly, but not enough to prevent the nearby crowd from hearing. You know, he said, people who pretend to be military usually get nervous around this point. Marcus met his eyes without any change in expression. I am not pretending, he said. The officer gave another short laugh and glanced briefly toward the gathering crowd, as if expecting someone to agree with him. Instead, the bystanders remained silent. One older man near the newsstand folded his arms and watched carefully, the way someone might observe a moment that could turn important very quickly. Above them, the large digital clock continued its quiet march forward, each second sliding past with mechanical precision. Marcus noticed it again and mentally calculated the time left before the briefing scheduled in Washington would begin. The call he had placed earlier had been brief, but it had reached exactly the person it needed to reach. What the officer standing in front of him did not know was that somewhere hundreds of miles away a small chain of decisions had already begun to unfold. Inside a Pentagon office, a senior official had listened to Marcus's message and immediately understood two things. First, that Commander Marcus Hayes was not a man who called unless something unusual had happened. And second, that the briefing waiting for him involved individuals who did not tolerate delays without explanation. Within minutes, several secure lines had begun connecting offices across Washington. A name had been spoken more than once. Hayes, Navy SEAL Commander, Atlanta Airport. The conversation had been short and direct. Back in the terminal, Carter finally gestured toward the seating area nearby. You might as well get comfortable, he said. This could take a while. Marcus did not sit down. Instead, he stood with the quiet discipline of someone who had spent years in environments where patience was often the strongest form of control. A woman near the coffee stand leaned toward her husband and whispered something under her breath while pointing at the uniform. The husband nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as if he recognized the insignia but could not quite place where he had seen it before. The digital clock above the gate changed again. 10 minutes had now passed since Marcus made the call. Somewhere outside the terminal, far beyond the glass walls and the busy runways, the first black government vehicle had just turned off the main highway and accelerated toward the airport entrance. The atmosphere inside the terminal had grown noticeably heavier, the kind of quiet tension that spreads through a crowded place when people sense that something important is about to happen. The usual airport noise still filled the air, rolling suitcases against tile, distant boarding announcements, the muffled rumble of jet engines outside the glass walls. But around gate C-17 a different silence had formed. Travelers were no longer pretending to ignore the scene. They watched openly now. Officer Daniel Carter shifted his stance again, glancing briefly toward the growing cluster of bystanders before turning his attention back to Marcus Hayes. The officer's confidence had not disappeared, but a small trace of irritation had crept into his posture, the subtle discomfort of someone who expected a situation to resolve quickly and instead found it stretching longer than planned. Marcus remained where he stood, composed and still, the deep blue of his navy dress uniform standing out against the bright terminal lights. The medals on his chest reflected faint glimmers as people moved nearby, each ribbon representing years of service that none of the onlookers could fully understand. Carter let out a slow breath and checked the watch on his wrist. You have been standing here a long time for someone who claims to have somewhere important to be, he said. Marcus did not respond immediately. His eyes moved once more to the large digital clock hanging above the gate. The numbers had changed again. Nearly 11 minutes had passed since he made the call. In another part of the country, that span of time would mean very little. But in Washington, where decisions often moved quickly when the right names were involved, 11 minutes was more than enough. Carter followed Marcus's glance and shook his head slightly. "Still watching the clock," he said. "Whatever you are waiting for is not going to show up." The crowd remained silent. A man wearing a business jacket near the charging station looked toward the large windows facing the runway, as if expecting something unusual to appear. At first there was nothing but the familiar airport scene outside. Shuttle buses moving between terminals. Baggage carts crossing the service lanes. Ground crew directing aircraft with glowing orange wands. Then a dark vehicle turned through the airport service gate near the far end of the terminal road. It moved quickly but smoothly, the kind of vehicle most travelers would barely notice unless they were specifically looking for it. A second vehicle followed behind it. Inside the terminal the shift was almost invisible, but Marcus noticed it. His posture did not change. His expression remained calm. Carter, however, had not yet seen the vehicles outside. He was still focused on the man in front of him. "You know," the officer said after a moment, his voice carrying a tone that suggested the situation had already been decided. "Pretending to be military is a serious offense." Marcus looked at him quietly. "I am aware," he said. Carter folded his arms again, appearing satisfied with his own conclusion. "Good," he replied. "Then we understand each other." The woman standing near the coffee stand glanced toward the windows and frowned slightly. The vehicles outside had now pulled closer to the terminal entrance. Their dark paint reflected the afternoon sun as they moved into the drop-off lane reserved for government transport and emergency vehicles. A man beside her followed her gaze and straightened slowly. "That is strange," he murmured under his breath. Carter finally noticed the change in attention among the bystanders and turned slightly toward the glass walls. At first he did not understand what they were seeing. Then he noticed the line of vehicles approaching the curb outside the terminal doors. The first one stopped cleanly near the entrance. The second vehicle pulled in behind it. A third appeared moments later. Inside the airport the crowd fell almost completely silent. Marcus Hayes remained exactly where he was, standing calmly beneath the bright lights of the terminal as the doors at the far end of the concourse began to open. The automatic glass doors at the far end of the concourse slid open with a quiet mechanical sound that barely rose above the background noise of the airport, yet the effect inside the terminal was immediate. Several heads turned at once. Travelers near the windows leaned slightly forward. The dark vehicles outside had stopped in a precise line along the curb, their engines still running, their polished surfaces reflecting the bright Georgia sunlight. For a moment nothing else happened, and the silence inside the terminal deepened. Officer Daniel Carter narrowed his eyes as he looked toward the entrance, trying to understand why so many people had suddenly shifted their attention in the same direction. Marcus Hayes did not move. He remained standing exactly where he had been for the past several minutes, shoulders relaxed, hands loosely at his sides, the disciplined stillness of someone who had spent years in environments where patience was often the difference between chaos and control. Carter glanced back at him briefly, and then again toward the entrance as the first figure stepped through the glass doors. The man who entered wore a dark navy suit, the kind worn by senior federal officials, and he moved with a direct purpose that caused several travelers to instinctively step aside as he passed. Behind him came two more men, both carrying the unmistakable posture of career military officers, even in civilian clothing. Their eyes scanned the terminal quickly, professionally, until one of them spotted the deep blue Navy uniform standing near gate C-17. The moment they saw Marcus Hayes, their pace changed. They began, walking directly toward him with steady, confident steps. Carter felt a small ripple of uncertainty pass through his thoughts, though he did not show it on his face. He shifted his stance again, watching the approaching group with cautious curiosity. The bystanders nearest the scene slowly parted, creating a narrow path through the small crowd as the three men approached. The man in the navy suit reached them first. He stopped directly in front of Marcus Hayes, and for a brief second the two men simply looked at each other, recognition clear in their expressions. Then the man nodded respectfully. "Commander Hayes," he said in a calm but unmistakably formal tone, "we received your call." The words hung in the air like a sudden change in weather. Carter's expression tightened slightly as he processed what he had just heard. The second man, a tall officer with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades inside the chain of command, stepped forward next. His eyes moved quickly across Marcus's uniform, taking in the ribbons, the insignia, and the calm posture of the man wearing them. Then he turned his attention toward Officer Carter. The shift in focus was subtle but powerful. The surrounding crowd seemed to lean closer without realizing it. Carter cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders, attempting to regain the confident tone he had maintained earlier. "Is there something I can help you gentlemen with?" he asked. The man in the Navy suit answered without hesitation. "Yes," he said evenly. "We are here regarding Commander Marcus Hayes." Carter glanced toward Marcus again, then back at the officials in front of him. For the first time since the situation began, the certainty in his expression began to fade slightly. The tall silver-haired officer spoke next, his voice measured and calm, but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Officer," he said, "do you understand who you have been detaining?" The word detaining landed quietly but heavily in the air. Carter hesitated for just a moment before responding. "This individual was being questioned regarding identification concerns," he replied carefully. The man in the Navy suit exchanged a brief look with the silver-haired officer. Neither of them appeared surprised. Instead, the first official simply turned slightly toward Marcus again. "Commander," he said, "are you ready to proceed to Washington?" Marcus glanced once more at the digital clock above the gate. Then he nodded calmly. Around them, the terminal had grown completely still. Travelers who had been preparing to board flights now stood quietly watching as the realization slowly spread through the crowd that the man in the Navy dress uniform had never been the one out of place in this terminal at all. For several seconds, no one in the terminal spoke. The quiet recognition that had begun spreading through the crowd now settled fully over the scene like a heavy curtain. The man in the Navy suit remained standing beside Marcus Hayes, calm and composed, while the tall silver-haired officer slowly turned his attention back toward Officer Daniel Carter. The difference in posture between the two men was subtle but unmistakable. Carter had stood confidently for most of the last 15 minutes, certain that he was controlling the situation. Now his shoulders had stiffened slightly, and his eyes moved between the officials and the decorated uniform in front of him as the realization continued to settle in. Marcus Hayes still had not raised his voice, and he had not moved from the spot where Carter first stopped him. The deep blue dress uniform remained perfectly composed, the polished shoes still aligned on the bright terminal floor, the rows of service ribbons resting quietly against his chest. The silver trident insignia above those ribbons now seemed to carry a different weight in the eyes of everyone watching. The tall officer with silver hair spoke again, his voice calm but carrying the quiet authority of decades spent inside the military chain of command. "Officer," he said evenly, "Commander Hayes is scheduled to brief senior defense officials in Washington within the hour." Carter swallowed lightly before answering. "Sir, I was only attempting to verify identification," he replied, the earlier certainty in his tone now replaced by careful formality. The man in the Navy suit gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "Verification is understandable," he said. "Detaining a decorated naval officer without confirming his credentials through proper channels is another matter." Around them, the travelers who had gathered nearby continued to watch in complete silence. Some still held their phones, recording the moment without moving. A young boy standing beside his mother stared at Marcus with wide eyes, clearly fascinated by the uniform and the unexpected attention surrounding it. Marcus glanced briefly toward the child and offered the smallest nod of acknowledgement before returning his attention to the officials beside him. The silver-haired officer stepped slightly closer to Carter. He did not raise his voice, and he did not make any threatening gesture. His calm alone carried more authority than any raised tone could have. "Commander Hayes has served this country for more than 20 years, the officer continued quietly. "His assignments include operations most people will never hear about." Carter shifted his stance again, the weight of the words settling over him as the surrounding crowd absorbed every sentence. The man in the Navy suit reached into his jacket and produced a small folder containing official documents. He opened it briefly, glanced at the contents, then closed it again. "The briefing in Washington has already been delayed," he said. "We cannot delay it any longer." Marcus nodded once in acknowledgement. "Understood," he said calmly. The silver-haired officer then turned fully toward Carter. His expression remained professional, but the message behind his words was unmistakable. "Officer Carter," he said, "this situation will be reviewed through the appropriate channels. The statement was not loud, yet it carried through the quiet terminal with complete clarity. Carter did not respond immediately. The earlier confidence that had defined his stance at the beginning of the encounter had completely disappeared, replaced now by a rigid stillness that revealed the growing realization of what had unfolded. Marcus Hayes adjusted the cuff of his uniform slightly, a small, controlled movement that reflected years of discipline rather than irritation. Then he looked once more at the digital clock above the gate. The time had continued moving forward throughout the entire encounter, steady and indifferent to the tension inside the terminal. The man in the Navy suit gestured politely toward the exit doors where the dark vehicles still waited outside. "Commander," he said, "our transport is ready." Marcus gave a small nod. Without another word, he stepped forward, the quiet crowd instinctively parting to allow him through as the officials moved with him toward the doors, leaving behind a terminal that had just witnessed a moment few people there would ever forget. The automatic doors opened again as Marcus Hayes stepped out of the terminal and into the bright afternoon light, the warm Georgia air carrying the distant roar of aircraft engines across the runway. The line of dark government vehicles waited along the curb with quiet precision, their engines humming softly as airport traffic continued flowing around them. The man in the Navy suit walked beside Marcus while the silver-haired officer followed just behind, both moving with the calm efficiency of people accustomed to urgent schedules and serious responsibilities. Inside the terminal, the crowd that had gathered near Gate C-17 slowly began to move again, but the energy had changed. Conversations resumed in hushed tones as travelers exchanged looks that said the same thing without words. They had just witnessed a moment where assumptions had collided with reality. Officer Daniel Carter remained standing in the same place where the encounter had begun. The space around him, once crowded with curious onlookers, was now slowly clearing as passengers returned to their flights. Yet the quiet weight of what had just happened remained. Carter looked toward the glass wall where Marcus and the officials were walking toward the vehicles outside. For the first time since the situation began, he seemed unsure where to place his hands or how to stand. The confident authority that had guided his actions earlier had faded into a rigid stillness. Across the terminal, a supervisor from airport security was already moving quickly through the concourse, guided by a message that had arrived moments earlier through official channels. News of the incident had traveled far faster than Carter realized. In Washington, the conversation that began with Marcus Hayes' brief phone call had not ended when the vehicles were dispatched. Inside several offices at the Pentagon, the details of the encounter had already been relayed through secure communication lines. The name of the airport, the name of the officer involved, the name of the commander who had been delayed. Each piece of information had moved through the system with quiet speed. Outside the terminal, Marcus paused briefly beside the first vehicle. The man in the Navy suit opened the rear door while the silver-haired officer turned slightly toward him. "Commander," he said respectfully, "the briefing room is ready when we arrive." Marcus nodded once, his calm expression unchanged despite the unusual delay. "Understood," he replied. He glanced once toward the terminal doors behind him where the bright interior lights reflected against the glass. For a brief moment, he could still see the silhouettes of travelers inside watching from a distance. Among them stood a young boy near the entrance who had been staring at Marcus's uniform earlier. The boy lifted his hand in a small, uncertain salute. Marcus noticed and returned the gesture with quiet dignity before stepping into the vehicle. The door closed softly behind him. Inside the terminal, the airport security supervisor finally reached Officer Carter. The man's expression was serious but controlled, the look of someone who had already received enough information to understand the significance of the situation. "Officer Carter," he said firmly, "we need to speak immediately." Carter nodded slowly, the earlier certainty in his posture replaced now by the careful attention of someone realizing that the moment was no longer under his control. Outside, the vehicles began to move away from the curb in a smooth line, merging into airport traffic before turning toward the highway that would lead north toward Washington. The afternoon sun reflected across the polished navy buttons on Marcus Hayes' uniform as he sat quietly in the back seat, already reviewing the briefing he had been preparing for weeks. Behind him, the airport returned gradually to its normal rhythm, but the story of what had just happened would travel far beyond the terminal walls. In offices where decisions carried real consequences, the quiet chain of accountability had already begun. The convoy moved steadily along the highway, leaving the airport behind as the skyline of Atlanta slowly faded in the distance. The vehicles maintaining a quiet formation that suggested urgency, without chaos. Inside the rear seat of the first vehicle, Marcus Hayes sat upright, with the calm focus of someone returning to a mission that had only been briefly interrupted. Across from him, the man in the Navy suit reviewed a tablet containing briefing documents, while the silver-haired officer beside him watched the road ahead with quiet concentration. The hum of the engine blended with the distant sound of traffic as the city moved around them. Marcus glanced once at the small digital clock on the dashboard. Time had continued moving forward throughout the entire encounter at the airport, and now every minute mattered again. The briefing in Washington involved decisions that would affect operations across several regions of the world, and the officials waiting in that secure conference room were not accustomed to delays. The man with the tablet looked up briefly and offered a small nod. "The briefing team has been informed that you are en route," he said. Marcus returned the nod calmly. "Good," he replied. "We can make up the time." The vehicles accelerated slightly as they merged onto the interstate heading north. Far behind them, the airport had already returned to its usual rhythm of arrivals and departures. But inside the administrative offices of the airport, the quiet consequences of the incident were only beginning to unfold. Officer Daniel Carter sat in a small conference room across from two airport supervisors and a representative from Federal Security. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of an aircraft taking off outside the building. Carter's uniform now seemed less imposing than it had earlier in the terminal. His posture remained straight, but the certainty that once guided his actions had been replaced by careful attention as he listened to the questions being asked. One supervisor reviewed a report on a tablet, while the federal representative spoke in a steady voice. "Commander Marcus Hayes is a senior member of the United States Navy Special Warfare Community," the representative explained. "His assignments include strategic briefings with senior defense officials." The delay this afternoon triggered a chain of notifications that reached the Department of Defense within minutes. Carter nodded slowly as the information settled in. The supervisor continued speaking, his tone professional but firm. "When incidents involve federal personnel of this level, they are reviewed not only by local authorities but also by higher agencies." The meaning of those words required no further explanation. In Washington, the news had already moved through the upper levels of command. Inside the Pentagon, several officers had watched a short video clip recorded by a traveler in the terminal earlier that afternoon. The clip showed the calm figure of Marcus Hayes standing in his Navy dress uniform while the situation unfolded around him. No raised voices. No confrontation. Just a quiet moment where assumptions had collided with reality. A senior defense official turned off the screen and folded his hands thoughtfully. "Commander Hayes handled that with remarkable discipline," he said. Another official nodded. "That is exactly why he leads the briefing today." Back on the highway, the convoy continued moving north under the fading afternoon sun. Marcus opened the folder resting on his lap and reviewed the notes for the presentation he was about to deliver. The delay at the airport had not changed the mission. It had only added another reminder of the patience and control that years of service had taught him. Outside the window, the landscape rolled past in long stretches of highway and distant hills. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere had returned completely to professional focus. The silver-haired officer glanced toward Marcus once more before speaking quietly. "Commander," he said, "when we arrive, the room will be ready." Marcus closed the folder and looked forward calmly. "Then let us make sure we give them exactly what they are waiting for." The convoy reached Washington as the evening lights settled across the wide avenues of the capital, the city moving with the steady rhythm of government buildings, quiet offices, and the distant hum of traffic crossing the Potomac River. The vehicles passed through a secure entrance and continued toward the Pentagon complex, where lights already glowed behind long rows of windows. Inside the first vehicle, Marcus Hayes looked once more at the folder resting on his lap before closing it with calm certainty. The delay at the airport had already faded into the background of his thoughts. For him, the mission had always been the briefing waiting ahead. The man in the Navy suit spoke softly as the vehicle slowed near the entrance. "They have been ready for you," he said. Marcus nodded once and stepped out of the vehicle when the door opened. The air outside was cooler than in Atlanta. carrying the quiet seriousness that surrounded the massive building. Inside a secure conference room, several senior officials sat around a long table reviewing maps and reports projected on a large screen. Conversations paused as the door opened and Marcus Hayes entered wearing the same calm expression he had carried through the entire day. One of the officials rose from his chair and extended a hand. "Commander Hayes," he said respectfully, "we appreciate you making it here." Marcus returned the handshake with the composed confidence of someone who had spent decades inside rooms where decisions shaped the safety of others. "Thank you for waiting," he replied. The briefing began only minutes later. Charts appeared on the screen. Satellite images rotated slowly across the display. Marcus spoke clearly and steadily as he walked the room through the information he had prepared for weeks. The officials listened carefully, asking precise questions and making notes as the discussion moved forward. Outside the room, the Pentagon continued its quiet work, unaware of the moment that had unfolded hours earlier in a crowded airport terminal. Back in Atlanta, the administrative review had already progressed. Inside a small office at the airport security headquarters, several supervisors finalized the preliminary report of the incident. The document contained timelines, witness statements, and references to federal communication that had followed the delay of Commander Hayes earlier that afternoon. Officer Daniel Carter sat silently across from them, listening as the findings were explained. The supervisors maintained a professional tone throughout the discussion, but the message was clear. Situations involving federal personnel of that level required careful judgment and proper verification procedures. The consequences would be determined through official review. Carter nodded slowly as he absorbed the information. The moment that had seemed routine at the beginning of his shift had become something far larger than he expected. Late that evening inside the Pentagon, the briefing finally concluded. The senior official who had welcomed Marcus earlier closed the final folder and looked around the room. "Commander Hayes," he said thoughtfully, "your analysis may prevent a serious problem." Marcus inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. For him, the recognition was not the important part. The mission had been completed, and that was enough. When he left the building later that night, the lights of Washington stretched quietly across the horizon. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, travelers were still moving through the same airport terminal where the encounter had taken place earlier in the day. Most of them would never know the full story of the man in the navy dress blues who stood calmly while assumptions were made about him. But those who witnessed it would remember something simple. Real strength